defines a generation. Music is a soundtrack of revolution. Music is a soundtrack of movement. Music is a soundtrack of cause. There is an intersection of politics and pop culture that you didn't even know existed. There is some boy, some girl sitting in a cubicle along K Street, somewhere in DC, a boy, a girl sitting in a cubicle along a hill with a Capitol with a dome who has single-handedly decided what you wore today. Whoa.
Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
Call it how it is. Hit it. I promise you, swear. I'm there, admit it.
What's happening, America? It is your boy Mike Muse of the Mike Muse Show. I'm so excited that you guys have joined me for another show, man. We, as I say every week, man, we're expanding, we're growing, we're having fun. The conversation is getting more in depth, and it's also getting more fun and informative. It's a blast, and I can't thank you enough for all the tweets and DMs that you send on the Facebook posts and even the emails that you guys are sending me. It's so much appreciated. It just lets me know that we are doing our job here at the Mike Muse Show to inform you on things that you may not be aware of and really to understand how to connect the dots. And so, again, another great episode on store for us today. It is interesting. We've been having this conversation a lot about a couple of things, right? Obviously, Facebook. I think you've heard of Facebook. You probably use Facebook, and you might be on Facebook right now listening to the show. And we always are. Facebook is in the news right now. They're having some little bit of difficulty. Those pesky Russians, right? And also, too, this fake news that we keep hearing about. And this episode really is to do a deep dive into this whole notion of really the science behind fake news and really the science behind how do we begin as a country to moderate this conversation of fake news, how to begin to moderate this conversation of censorship, and whose role and whose responsibility is it in this scenario, and what responsibility do companies like Facebook have in ensuring a responsible use in news sharing, and when does that come into conflict with notions of free speech? How do we strike a balance? At what point, if at all, should society hold individuals behind the keyboard accountable? And furthermore, what are safety, political, and legal and logistical considerations to think about as technology becomes increasingly more integral in everyday lives? As you know, ladies and gentlemen, I never formulate my opinion until after the show is done. I like to see where the conversation is going to go. But things that I've been really curious about as I've been listening to the news is this three buckets, if you will, right? Do we want government to really be regulating companies like Facebook when Mark Zuckerberg actually came to the Hill in the hearing, and we saw that the senators themselves struggled with this notion of how Facebook actually operates? And so if you are concerned about how you can't really put into words and can't understand the context of Facebook and how it operates, then should you be the ones to offer the regulations as possible? And then two, as users, when does it become our responsibility to censor what it is that we are looking at on our news feed? If you see a site, one of my homies, Tyrone, he's always sending me articles of information regarding just news of the day, if you will. And there's always some random link that he sends, right? It's like coffeemugs.com, and there'll be a story about Iran nuclear deal. And I'm just like, what does coffeemugs.com have to do anything with the nuclear Iran deal? And so should we begin to question our sites that we're getting it from? And then thirdly, as a company, as a corporations, what is our ask of them in terms of censorship and freedom of speech, right? We want to be careful how much we overly censor, because that runs into a dangers of affecting marginalized communities and communities of color. Communities of color use social media in order to really get issues of the day that are out there. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement. Think about a lot of other issues that have come up through social media has been brought to attention in the foreground. And so it allows that communication for that space. And so to really help us guide us through this very complicated and nuanced discourse and conversations, I decided to have some really cool guys today on this show. The first up, though, is a gentleman by the name of Eugene Yee. Eugene is a co-founder and president of Cortico. It's a nonprofit rooted in laboratories of social science with MIT Media Lab. So Basically, what that means is Eugene's just smart. Eugene led the production for the Electome project at MIT Media Labs. And Eugene previously was head of Asia public policy for Twitter and helped develop the company's hyperlocal and global corporate social responsibility mission. And prior to Twitter, Eugene worked at the United States Department of State at Embassy in Beijing as political officer covering internet freedom in the six-party talks from 2009 to 2011. And he was a strategist for East Asia national security issues for the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the United States Department of Defense, and formerly served as a country director for China and Korea at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So basically, he is one of the perfect persons to talk about this conversation because clearly he has a tech background to really understand the science behind it all. Clearly, he has the foreign experience dealing with the Department of State and Department of Defense to really talk about how do we exchange with these foreign actors who are trying to infiltrate our systems. Eugene, welcome to the Mike Muse Show, my friend.
Hey, Mike. It's really great to be here. What a joy.
Yeah, excited to have you, man. Listen, you have a lot of things in your bio, and so I hope I gave you the proper introduction that was due to you on that.
Yeah, you said a lot of words, but I'm just happy to be here kind of repping Cortico today, which is the nonprofit that I currently work at up here in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Now, Eugene, I know Cortico, you guys say you are there to foster a healthy public sphere. Explain to us, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I kind of, I guess a lot of where that comes from was just this kind of observation that our American public sphere, which we think is, where like the physical and the mediated spaces where people can come together and share information, discuss, kind of like on this talk radio show. We think that a lot of those different surfaces are actually ailing. One of the things that we see nationally is that we're pretty polarized as a nation and kind of fragmented in terms of our culture. So that I think a lot of us think that that civility is kind of giving way to hostility, and there's a lot of hot button issues like immigration, race, guns, all the things that you talk about on your show, Mike, that I think has become much more difficult to discuss. So we're interested in kind of seeing and understanding those trends, but also thinking about how can we actually make that better? How can we actually start to work on our community roots, on media and politics? How can we actually start to build a healthier environment so that we can actually come together as a nation and talk about all these things in a pretty healthy, civil way?
Now, how do you guys grab that information? And listeners, I mean, I got to be honest with you. You must follow Eugene. He's hilarious. So don't let all this smart stuff fool you. The brother is a comedian and satirical at that. But also, too, I've had the chance to see some of the work that they do and these colorful nodes that they can create. Eugene, talk to us a little bit about the nodes, right, in terms of how you guys gather information and how you put that into context. Because, listeners, I want to just set you up for something before Eugene start talking, that Twitter discovered through a recent MIT study that I'm sure Eugene was a part of, lies are 70% more likely to be retweeted than facts. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Twitter did a study with MIT that said lies are 70% more likely to be retweeted than facts. What's more, a false story reaches 1,500 people 6 times quicker on average than a true story. And while false stories outperform the truth on every subject, including business, terrorism, war, science, technology, entertainment, fake news about politics regularly does best. And so with that being said, Eugene, how does Cortico get involved in this conversation now to do the assessments of that data that I just discussed?
Yeah, so that study that you just talked about, Mike, is one of my buddies, Suresh Vasuji, was with the main authors of that. He's part of, he was at the Laboratory for Social Machines, which is a group at the MIT Media Lab. And he is baller. He's so amazing at what the type of stuff that he studies. He just got this amazing position at Dartmouth as well, where he'll be teaching more and kind of doing a lot of that stuff on like computational propaganda. But that study that he, another researcher named Snell Ural, and then my co-founder for Cortico, Deb Roy, was working on, basically you summarized it perfectly, where we found that falsehood, not fake news. I think fake news is a subcategory of falsehood. Falsehood diffuses much faster, like much farther and much deeper than a lot of the truth that we see in all categories of information. And in fact, you can see that propagate way more by an order of magnitude. So it's like, at least like 10 times. And a lot of that study, what we did as as a research group was we have this really cool relationship with Twitter, where Twitter kind of allows us to access the full fire hose of tweets that they offer, which are a lot, like hundreds of millions of tweets per day. And what we do there is we're able to kind of understand and parse that using some machine learning algorithms. You can just understand that as kind of a way to have computers tell you what kind of, what are people talking about, who's doing the talking, and how does that information move. So kind of looking at a bunch of things. So we took what was false from a lot of these fact-checking sites like PolitiFact, Snopes.com. So there's hundreds of thousands of these rumors and false news or false pieces of news that we were able to take, and then we saw how those pieces of information traveled across the Twitter sphere. And this wasn't as we did that type of research. I think we were able to benchmark it against other pieces of true information in the same types of categories and content, and around the same time, kind of normalizing for all that. And you do see kind of a frightening phenomena that falsehood does diffuse farther and faster and deeper.
Well, Eugene, you bring me to the next point I want to talk about. And listeners, I think you've heard me talk. So if you've been following me since the beginning of my journey, I love technology. I love doing deep dives into the categories of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and big data. So now I have to insert my street cred, if you will, when it comes to technology. Eugene and I actually are next-gen tech policy fellows. And so he and I work together really doing a deep dive into this exact conversation, this narrative, which Eugene brings me to the next point I want to discuss with you is almost like the chicken or the egg. I feel like, we are really focused on cybersecurity, and I'm kind of leading in from my next guest. We look at cybersecurity from like this infrastructure, if you will, this malware, this bogus email. If you open it up, it's going to penetrate your system and cause huge damage and harm, right? But we tend to lose sight of the information warfare that's really happening, and that really begins to stem from a user who has to create a profile page on Facebook or on Twitter can then trick the algorithms into disseminating this false information. And the work that you're doing and all the technology that you guys are really invested in, do you see that we're kind of focused on the wrong thing? Should we just be focused on the cyber infrastructure and not really pay attention to how do we disrupt the information war or this disinformation war, if you will? Or should we focus on how do we disrupt the information war over cybersecurity? So is it chicken or the egg, or do we need to do a combination of both?
Yeah, and maybe I can kind of break what you're saying down into a couple of categories too, Mike. I think, I think we all realize that there's a lot of political and cultural fragmentation right now. And I think we can say technology has a part in promoting that. We see that, on all different types of social media platforms that things can propagate, and there's these echo chambers that form. And what I see, at least from my vantage point, is there's kind of these three buckets of different solutions that I think a lot of people have been grappling with ever since we started to realize that we had a problem here. And the first is what you mentioned in your intro. It's like, hey, let's bring on all these social media companies, and then let's figure out a way to regulate them. And you have the government, kind of the Senate hearing committees where they bring on all these corporate social media executives, and they say, hey, we're going to regulate you, and they kind of ask these questions. So that's kind of method number one. Method number two is you see this super this explosion of fake fact checking organizations. So people who are trying to combat fake news and all of this kind of different types of misinformation out there with like these elite teams that go out and kind of play this kind of arms race with the people who are building this type of fake news. And then kind of, I think the third category of organizations that I see is, hey, like, we know that there's all this stuff happening in the digital landscape, but how do we start to really build trust? Like, how do you build trust with one another? Like, where can we actually, how can we connect together? Can we actually reclaim our connections to one another as a society, and that, start to use empathy to reach across different partisan lines? And is there a role for technology to do that? And I think each of those approaches has pros and cons to it. I think regulation, that's kind of like the Minority Report stuff. It's like, hey, the government wants the social media platforms to, before bad things happen, go take it down or kind of prevent that. Yeah. And I think that there's some things that are problematic with that approach. I think we still need that type of regulation, but we need to be smart about how we do that. For like battling fake news, it's like a whack-a-mole game, right? Where it's an arms race.
I actually like the whole issue of the Minority Report. That's a really great visualization in terms of the whole, the premeditated. For those who are not familiar, it's a movie about premeditated murder and how do you prevent premeditated murder using these different cogs. They're able to predict the future. And so I think that is something that we need to really begin to ask some serious questions about in terms of, is there a way to disrupt that information and what does that look like? And I couldn't think of another better guest to bring in to really answer all those three categories that Eugene just outlined than Jeff Kosseff. Jeff is an assistant professor of cybersecurity law at the U.S. Naval Academy. He is the author of Cybersecurity Law, a textbook, and his latest book, 26 Words That Created the Internet, a history of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That's going to be published early next year. He previously did cybersecurity law at Covington and Burling. He has clerked for judges of the Ninth Circuit, and before becoming a lawyer, he was a technology journalist for the Oregonian. And get into this, folks, and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. But most important, though, Jeff is actually my roommate from freshman year at the University of Michigan. So I think that is better than a Pulitzer Prize finalist. I don't know, Jeff. What do you have to say about that, buddy?
That is my greatest distinction, of course.
Jeff, what is happening, man? Who would have thought, brother, when we first met?
Great to be with you.
Man, who would have thought freshman year when we first met in West Quad that you would be a finalist for Pulitzer Prize and I would have my own radio show, man? Who would have thought?
I know, it's really, really great. And I guess we balance out the rest of the people on our floor, but I think that's another, a whole other radio show.
That's a different topic altogether, man. Yeah. I really miss you. Ladies and gentlemen, his grandmother was the sweetest lady. She would always call up, "Is Jeffrey there?" And the cutest New York's old lady accent, man. So that's what's up, man. Jeff, welcome to the Mike Muse Show, man. So happy to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've done some incredible work in this space. And really, I think you're the perfect person to really bring on board this notion of what Eugene is really talking about. But what's interesting is you're becoming an expert in the whole notion of Section 230 and the 26 words that outline it. And listeners, it goes, quote, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider," end quote. Jeff, what the hell does that mean, buddy?
Okay, well, happy to talk about it. I've spent about 2 years on those 26 words and writing about 150,000 words on those 26 words. So wow. They've had a huge impact. Before I start, I should just preface that what I say is not the position of the U.S. government or DOD. Mike knows that it's particularly good for me to say that because who knows what I will end up saying. The Section 230, to understand it, you have to go back way before the internet was, at least in its modern form, was even conceived. In the 1950s, there were a lot of newsstands and bookstores that were being prosecuted, or the owners were being prosecuted for selling obscene books, magazines, those sorts of things. There was actually one bookseller who was arrested in Los Angeles. His name's Eleazar Smith, and sentenced to 30 days in prison for selling an erotic book that really is tame by today's standards, but back then was considered obscene and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. He challenged this conviction all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court had said in 1959 is that if you're merely a distributor of the book or of any content provided by a third party, you are only liable for that content if it's harmful in any way or illegal if you knew of the content. And he said he was a 72-year-old man, and he said, I don't read the books that I sell on my newsstand. There's thousands of them. So that was the rule. So the Supreme Court overturned his conviction, saying he didn't know about this book. So that was the rule until the early 1990s. And then it got a little more complicated because we had services like Prodigy and CompuServe where people would connect first to each other to a centralized bulletin board and then later to the broader internet as we know it. And Prodigy and CompuServe were the two main providers of these services. AOL came along after, this was back in the ancient days when Mike and I were in college. So Prodigy and CompuServe had two very different business models. CompuServe basically had bulletin boards, and they did not censor, moderate anything. They didn't have any content policies. They said users can post what they want. Prodigy wanted to distinguish itself, so it took a very family-friendly approach. It hired moderators. It had all sorts of policies. It would ban users. And both CompuServe and Prodigy were sued for defamation by people who were the subject of third-party content. And the courts created this odd rule, and they said, you can get this limited First Amendment immunity only if you don't do anything to moderate the content, because therefore you're just a distributor. So CompuServe was off the hook. But Prodigy, because it took steps to create a safe environment for its users, the court said Prodigy could be sued for harmful content because it was like a publisher. What the court said is Prodigy is more like a newspaper that is printing letters to the editor. It can select things.
But
so,
Jeffrey,
so
I'm sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
Yes. So this came out in 95, and then members of Congress identified this, and they said as a problem because they wanted to give incentives for companies to moderate third-party content. So that's when they passed Section 230, which the 26 words that you read are the heart of it, which basically say you're not going to be treated as the publisher or speaker of information that's provided by another information content provider. The idea being that the online services would take responsibility and actually moderate the content and create a safe environment. And the second reason was the internet was new. This was 1996. And the members of Congress didn't want to over-regulate the internet.
So you're saying some really interesting things, Jeffrey. One about regulation and censorship, but for those not familiar with CompuServe and Prodigy, how does that relate to current times? Right? How does that relate to Twitter, for example? So does this allow Twitter to actually go forth and be prosperous as a business? Does this allow Facebook to go forward and to operate as a business because of Section 230? And if so, how?
So the United States is the only country in the world that has immunity as strong as Section 230 for online services. And it's not a coincidence that the most successful online platforms are based in the United States. Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, Yelp, none of them, even Google, none of them could exist in their current forms if they didn't have this fairly broad protection for content created by users, because they all rely on user content. I mean, take away user content, and I don't know what Facebook or Twitter can be. Right. And they're not going to be able to take legal responsibility for every single thing that all of their users post. That's just not practical.
So, Jeffrey, what's interesting is you were able to connect the dots to a guy in a bookstore in the 1950s all the way to currently that has allowed Twitter, Facebook, and all those other technology companies to exist here in the United States. If for all intents, practical reasons, Jeff, basically what you're saying is that if a user posts a defamatory comment on Twitter, the subject cannot successfully sue Twitter for defamation, but it can sue the tweeter?
Exactly. And the problem with that, there are a few problems. The first is that people can use anonymizing technology like Tor, for example, to mask their IP address, so it makes it difficult often to identify who the person is who is actually writing the post. So you can always sue the person who wrote it if you can identify them. And the second is, even if you can identify them, oftentimes they're someone living in their parents' basement without any assets to their name. So even if you sue them and win, you're not going to get anything. If you sue Twitter and win, and we're talking about a different financial reward.
What's interesting about that, though, is you lead us right into where we actually left off with Eugene. So it's almost going forward to actually go backwards, because one regard you can talk about, this is where we get into censorship, ladies and gentlemen. This is where we get into freedom of speech, if you will. So there's an economic reason that, if Twitter didn't have Section 230 or Facebook didn't have Section 230, they would have to hire essentially monitors to monitor the content of every tweet, every post that gets posted. And that doesn't really make economically sound decisions, while at the same time, though, it begins to dovetail into the whole Minority Report idea that Eugene is just talking about. And so, ladies and gentlemen, stick with us, get involved in this conversation. Tweet me at I am Mike Muse, MUSE. You can also tweet us at Serious Insight, at SXM Insight. We're going to take a short break, come right on back, because we're going to keep going further with this fascinating conversation right here on the Mike Muse Show.
Quick release the cash, watch it fall slowly.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mike Muse Show. I am sure you are feeling so much more smarter right now, because I know that I am as well. I didn't even think about the movie Minority Report before we began this show, and now I'm thinking about Minority Report, Tom Cruise. It's really strange right now, but nonetheless, those are things I'm thinking about, man. In history, like the 1950s, a guy in the bookstore has allowed companies like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp to be in existence to this day, man. It's just so interesting how you can connect the dots to history, you can connect the dots to technology, and you can connect the dots to the possibilities, man. Your tweets are coming in right now, just letting me know that you do feel smarter. So thank you for rocking with your boy on that one too as well. I just want to jump right back into it, man. Don't want to waste any more time. Jeffrey, we were talking about before the break with Eugene and this whole notion of the Minority Report, right? In terms of predictive modeling, and I posed to Eugene the idea of, are we looking at it from the wrong way in terms of infrastructure and when it comes to cybersecurity, and should we be looking at it from an information warfare perspective? And so how do we disrupt that? So I want to get your take on that, and then Eugene, followed by you, I want to get involved with you in terms of policy and kind of thinking about your policy background experience. Is there a way that policy and law, if ever, intersects in the work that you're doing at Cortico? So Jeff, take it away, my friend.
So I think in the cybersecurity profession, we tend to think about issues in really narrow buckets depending on our experiences. So there are some people who would say that an attack on the electric grid is what the cybersecurity field should be focusing on, which obviously it should be, because we do not want blackouts for weeks and weeks caused by a foreign attacker. But there are other problems also. There are huge problems, and some that we can't even predict. The best way to look at it is, in cybersecurity, there's a term known as the CIA triad, and it's not the spy agency. It's called confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And those are the three principles that, so you want confidentiality. You don't want hackers to break into a politician's email, for example, and post all of the information. That would be a compromise on confidentiality. Compromise on integrity is basically making sure that the information out there is accurate. So that's where we get into the fake news issue. And availability, that's an attack on the electric grid. That's ransomware, which is deployed against hospitals oftentimes, or increasingly, and that makes it so that they can't even see patients because they can't access their medical records unless they pay huge fees. So I think we need to conceive of cybersecurity as a much more broader field than we currently do. I'll give one quick example. At the RSA convention, which is the biggest sort of cybersecurity industry convention.
What does RSA stand for, Jeff?
I'm not. It's
okay. Just go for it. Tweet us later about it.
And so at the RSA convention, it's thousands of people. And one of the keynotes this year was Monica Lewinsky. And she has really taken on a role, really admirable role, in fighting online bullying. And I think it's really telling that RSA said, online bullying is a cybersecurity issue. So we're going to have this speaker who has a very unique perspective on online bullying and give her a platform. So I think that's the way that we should be conceiving of cybersecurity and not just looking at whatever the issue of the day is.
Well, Eugene, with that, and speaking of, since Jeff mentioned online bullying, and now I'm thinking about online ideas and how online bullying or just the use of narratives now are so computational. A lot of it's driven by algorithms that can scale it in different ways and do strategic targeting using the big data. Should we be having more of a broader conversation about algorithms? And if so, in the work that you've been doing, and maybe not specifically the work that you're doing, just in dealing with and discussing in your colleagues and traveling the country and the world, really discussing these type of issues, should we begin to start looking at algorithm in ways to go on offense versus playing on defense? And when do we begin to really look at technology, not just from the sense of the platforms, but just the idea of technology itself?
I think the way that I'd answer your question is more about a kind of a phenomena that I'm seeing right now. Instead of offense or defense, I think we see kind of a really interesting change in technology where these artificial intelligence algorithms are actually advancing so quickly that I think the human-machine spectrum is starting to blur. So when I actually joined Twitter, I was really excited about all the things that Jeff was talking about. I was thinking about there's this kind of good versus evil battle of civil liberties and kind of how you actually balance that against national security prerogatives, which are very important as well. And I thought that was going to be kind of the center of the maelstrom, it was kind of the center of the issues that were really important to us. And I started to realize that was changing. And kind of where I saw that change happen first was actually in the lead up to the now 2 election cycles ago in South Korea. So if you look at, I think many of your listeners might not know this, but I think in South Korea, they ran an election to a now impeached President Park Geun-hye. And President Park, when she was actually campaigning for her election, there were all these interesting kind of astroturfing accounts that started to emerge, where you had Facebook identities that were writing posts that were pro President Park, or she wasn't president back then, but pro Park, or Twitter accounts that were pro Park. And later, it was found that the Korean National Intelligence Service, so kind of you think of them as their CIA and NSA kind of combined equivalent, was actually building all these accounts and all these bots and trying to influence the South Korean people to go vote a certain way. The reason why they did it, I can get into later, but the quick and dirty part of that is that they thought that Park was way more conservative and a hawkish candidate. And they saw kind of North Korea as a threat. So as a security, kind of an intelligence organization, having a more conservative president was better for their national security. So you kind of see those dynamics. And ultimately, you could have seen, oh, these are not that great bots. So you can see that there's on the spectrum of the bot to the human, there are very stupid bots that are, tweeting, I am a bot, every hour on the dot.
Yeah.
And then you get super smart people. You might not be on that side, Mike, but maybe Jeff is, right? So
Shots fired, Eugene.
You get Jeff on the other side. And what's kind of interesting is that spectrum is now blurring. You're getting really interesting AI algorithms that are able to kind of take 2 different tweets that are pro-Russia or pro, North Korea, and able to combine that and actually use different types of word embeddings and machine learning processes to actually concatenate that into a certain type of opinion that might not have existed before. But boy, that looks really realistic. And
Eugene,
Yeah.
I just did a fist bump in the air, buddy. This is exactly where I want the conversation to land, in my mind, just really thinking about this, man, because I believe the conversation hasn't progressed beyond the talking points that we've been discussing. And I think that if we always stick to this conversation along the party line talking points, we really don't address the issue, which is technology at its core. And I loved how you brought up a neutral example of what's happening in South Korea to really begin to understand that this is well beyond just 2016, man. This has nothing to do anymore with Hillary Clinton and with Donald Trump. Now, man, these individuals and foreign operators, if you will, have gotten so sophisticated now that they're able to target nuance, dialogue, and discourse that we're having currently today in 2018 that had nothing to do with 2016. And so they're even able to pick up now on where we are as a nation and the issues that we care about, which means there is a human element to it. And the reason why the human element is able to go as far as it is because of AI, is because of machine learning, is because of big data is able to do that. And so look, Eugene, I'm about to ask a really controversial question to you, and I'm going to make a controversial comment. And so I'm ready for people to tweet at me and to argue with me online. I think that Facebook is really being used as a scapegoat because our government doesn't really understand how else to talk about it from a nuanced perspective. And yes, does Facebook share some responsibility? And I'm sure Jeff will have a different opinion on this. Yeah, right. But at the end of the day, is it fair for us to put this blame solely on Facebook? I can't tell you how frustrated I get sometimes when I saw Mark Zuckerberg being, tossed out into the Senate hearing committee. And by the way, I don't even know Mark Zuckerberg, so I really feel bad for this uber billionaire guy. So I'm be very clear with that. But I guess I was more disappointed in the conversation of that. If we don't recognize that it's bigger than Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, that we're going to lose the ability to be solution oriented around this. So I stated my controversial opinion, Eugene, and you don't have to agree with me at all. But do you think that we are misplacing where we should be looking? And is Facebook being used as a scapegoat? And is the conversation broader than Facebook? And is it more nuanced?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I have another question, so that if other people are interested in continuing the conversation, here's a question. Out of all the social media platforms, if one of them disappeared today, do you think, or which one, or let's say all social media platforms disappeared, do you think the world is better off than it is with those social media platforms? And would love to hear everyone's response to that. And, you can kind of include Facebook in that mix too. So if Facebook were gone today, is the world a better place?
That's a great question. Listeners, tweet us right now at I am Mike Muse, MUSSAME, and at SXM Insight to answer that question. And we're going to get Eugene into it in the Twitter handles, and I'll retweet him too as well. But keep going, Eugene.
Yeah. Well, I think the questions that you're asking are important. The issues are so nuanced. I think what kind of the reasons why I think some of these social media executives are being called into these testimonies and these hearings are multifaceted. There's a lot of scapegoating that is happening, but there is also certain things that are truly problematic as well. So I think what I like to think about in this mix is kind of how do we address this as a community, as a society? I think regardless of anyone's politics, we can probably agree that our public sphere is sick. Our ability to connect to one another is getting harder. Ironically, right? We thought the internet was going to come and be able to connect everyone, but actually it's kind of hard. Everyone is kind of getting stuck in their own information bubbles and kind of different silos. The liberals are kind of in their own media bubble, and I think the conservatives are also kind of being accused of being in their own bubble. And I think what's hard is if we continue to exist in this world, like we start to lose our shared reality, and we need to have some sort of kind of common ground that we come together as a nation so that we can talk about issues that drive, our policy forward, make sure that we as a nation are strong and are able to remain strong. And I think a lot of those things are now just degrading and devolving into like name calling, a lot of dehumanization, partly because we don't understand each other. And how can we understand each other when the media environment is so polarized, when kind of you have like local news businesses. How many of you guys are in a town or a city where your local newspaper has been just struggling or has just disappeared in the past couple of years? That's happening to newspapers. Local newspapers that have won Pulitzer prizes are disappearing in the past couple of years. And
somebody said the word.
Really worrisome.
Somebody said the word Pulitzer Prize. That means Jeffrey, come into the conversation, buddy. And whatever you do, Jeffrey, man.
I lost the Pulitzer Prize, so
you're a finalist though. And Jeffrey, just do me a favor. Do not ask a question. Eugene has gotten really excited right now, so he's playing guest and moderator, throwing out poll questions right now. So, Jeff, just to ask.
Sorry, Mike.
It's all good, baby. You're welcome to ask questions here on the Mike Muse Show, Eugene. But Jeff, I'm just curious about the question that I posed to Eugene. Is Facebook being used as a scapegoat, right? And should we look at it from more nuanced angles? And if we only focus on Facebook, are we not really putting our eye on where we should be? I'm curious, as a cyber expert that you are, just your thoughts on that.
Well, I think there are a number. I don't think it's just Facebook that's at the center. Obviously, there were the hearings. I think there's Twitter, YouTube. Twitter and YouTube particularly have received criticism for extremist and terrorist content being on their platform. So there's a really wide range of criticism of online platforms in general, and some of it is deserved and some of it is not. I think part of the problem is that until recently, there hasn't been the degree of transparency that one would hope from many of the platforms in terms of providing insight into how they actually are moderating content. That's changed, and that's a great thing. There have been a few conferences that I've attended, public conferences where the platforms all have people come up and speak and say, this is what we're doing. These are the thousands of moderators that we hire. These are the levels of review all the way up to our general counsel. This is the AI that we use. And that's all a good thing. And I think much of it does come from the misunderstanding because there has sort of been this secrecy. And I think that the platforms, given the role that they play in society right now in speech, they do have an obligation to be transparent about how they moderate content. There's a professor who recently wrote a Harvard Law Review article, Kate Klonick, who calls the platforms the new governors of speech. And I think that's a really interesting point, that they are in many ways taking on the de facto role as censors in many cases, and they do have to explain how and why they do things. And I think it often is a very thoughtful approach that they apply.
Well, Jeff, you're also leading me into a next point then that let's really look into for a moment is privacy and privacy law. That's one of your specialties that you exist in. As we begin to talk about the new governors of freedom of speech, and as we look at Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, they all have departments that essentially have censorship departments that really look for hate speech, if you will, so they can flag and remove. But in your opinion, though, is there a danger as we begin to talk about this in terms of freedom of speech and censorship that it can go too far in terms of privacy? And if so, who do you see as most at risk for consequences of that? And I guess what I mean by that is I started the show off talking about, those can be impacted by over-censorship as marginalized communities. One, do you agree with that assessment? And then two, do you think there's a danger that we could go into over-censorship that might do undue just to freedom of speech?
I think that there's absolutely a danger of marginalized communities, really on all sides of the political spectrum. Some that we might agree with, some that we might not agree with, being right at that border of being dubbed as fake news and being blocked by a social media platform because there's not a clear line there. And when you have a private platform that is making a unilateral decision that I will not let this person speak because it violates our policies, and that platform is one of the only avenues effectively for speech, then that can raise concerns. Now, the opposing view would say, well, if Facebook or Twitter or any other platform starts to over-censor so much that the market will basically force them to either change or go out of business because there's a marketplace for ideas, and people will not go to a platform that basically censors a large amount of speech that they want to see. So there's not really a clean way to address this problem. And from what I've seen, at least from what the platforms have been presenting in public, is that they're at least making thoughtful attempts to address this unsolvable problem.
Mm-hmm. So, Eugene, with that being said, as we talking about marginalized communities from all sides of the political spectrum, if you will, in the work that you're doing and in the data collection that you guys are working with at Cortico, I know a big part of that is mapping and tracking, if you will, the public sphere for digital hygiene, digital health, if you will, for healthy debate and discourse. What are you noticing in terms of ways that we should be able to reconcile allowing for freedom of speech to move forward without having an impact on freedom of speech and not impacting marginalized communities across the spectrum?
Yeah, well, I think we all have the freedom to speak, and I think if you want to be kind of a bully, or if you want to kind of hurl F-bombs at someone online, you certainly have the freedom to do that. But does that actually allow for actually good interactions? It's kind of like what I imagine is we've all been at that dinner table where there's like someone who's speaking way too loudly, kind of maybe a little bit, kind of antagonistically, and it has this kind of chilling effect around the dinner table where you're like, just because that person is like opining in that particular way and that particular method, it's kind of clamping down on the conversation. So when you talk about free expression, there's a lot of dynamics to how we can actually cultivate that type of really good environment where people actually do feel comfortable talking and like sharing their opinion. We think that everyone is really polarized, but in the lab and at Cortico, a lot of us, we talked about the murmuring majority, where I actually think both sides of the political spectrum have some good points, but boy, I can't express my support one way or another because I'm going to get ripped a new one because of my opinion. But I think, how do you provide that condition? And I think for us at Cortico and at the MIT Media Lab, we're interested in a concept of building public sphere health metrics. So the concept there is kind of like, if you want to know if you are the green movement. So now a lot of America's best, energy companies, oil companies, to buildings, they all think that that they want to pursue a green agenda. They care about the earth that God gave us to live in. And I think what is really cool about that is you can only do that if you map and track. So you got to understand, hey, what is the air quality here? What is the lead rating for this building? So that I know that I'm making a good, making a good push. And right now, if you look at our public sphere, no one is out there who's able to, from an objective perspective, with all the cool, technology and kind of the know-how to be able to map that. So we think that a lot of the work that we're doing in building public sphere health metrics can actually become a starting point for that type of conversation of, what is the air quality index? What is the pollution index of these parts of our public sphere that we can take so that we understand if we want to improve it, that we can improve it. So maybe in certain parts of the public sphere you don't want to, if you don't want to say F-bombs at your grandma's kitchen table, but when you're at a comedy club, maybe that's totally okay. So I think there's all these different nuances and kind of different ways to be able to talk about that as a society. So we're hopeful that we can build something that allows people to think about this in a completely new and fresh way.
I like how you did that, and that really actually does answer that question, right, in terms of how do you reconcile what Jeff and I were just talking about in terms of censorship and freedom of speech versus the health sphere of our conversation and discourse on social media. Gentlemen, and for 30 seconds for each of you, I'll start with you, Jeff. what is one thing that you want to add? What is one thing that you believe we as a nation should be considering as we grapple with this notion of the science of fake news? In just 30 seconds, what do you think should be included in the conversation that really isn't there right now or isn't really focused on enough?
So I think probably what we need to focus on most for this fake news debate is to realize the limits of the government's involvement. The Supreme Court, I'll just end briefly on another Supreme Court case a few years ago.
30 seconds, Jeff.
Struck down a law saying that you can't lie about having a military honor. And they said saying a lie is not something that's excluded from the First Amendment. So this is not necessarily going to be a legal solution to this problem. I think we have to look at things that Eugene has been talking about.
Wow, that was really good, Jeff. You didn't listen 30 seconds, man. I'm impressed. Ladies and gentlemen, you see what I had to go through as being his roommate. Goodness gracious, 4 a.m. conversations, man. Eugene, 30 seconds or less. What do you think we should be focused on the nation that we're not currently focused on the nation as we begin to grapple with this dynamic?
I think we need to listen more. I think we need to listen to each other more. And there's a lot of different ways that we can listen. And I think where we need to kind of go in terms of listening is just really back to our communities and our local communities. I think there's a lot of kind of stuff floating out there in the digital ether. And if we are able to understand more like what's going on in our communities, there's a level of trust, with you and your neighbor, kind of the people that you live around, that's not afforded in kind of a completely internet-based community. And I think we need to shine more light onto our local communities. How can we do that in an era where things are becoming more digitally connected? How can we actually rehydrate our roots to how we connect and how we know more about the people around us? And I think if we can get that question right, I think America is off to a really strong place. And we should be throwing as much technology towards that problem as we can, as opposed to, I think, some of the other areas that a lot of people are thinking and talking about right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, we just did it. We just saw the problem, guys. I actually didn't, like I always said before, I never know where we're going to land by the end of the show. And I think we actually just landed on a solution, gentlemen, when it comes to community. And Eugene, I never really thought about that or put that in context until just now. If we can really begin to focus on our local newspapers, our local media outlets, because we know them, right? We understand who they are. They're humans. They're not bots. They're not algorithms. They're a trusted source that we can call up on our local newspaper. We can go to our newspaper and sit down with the journalist or reporter to really talk about that. So I think that's actually brilliant. And the local is being, driven away by, because of profit and business margins as we focus so much on national. But ladies and gentlemen, I think that's the solution. Community and local, start there. I can't thank you guys enough for joining the Mike Muse Show. Ladies and gentlemen, tweet me at I am Mike Muse, M-U-S-S-A-M-E. Jeff, where can they reach you at on Twitter?
J Kosseff, J-K-O-S-S-E-F-F.
And Eugene, where can they reach you at?
We're at Cortico, Cortico, and check us out.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are
having
out. I'll see you next week.